Hey, everybody, and welcome to our new webinar series here at Vicarius, where we take a deep dive on cybersecurity and vulnerability management related topics that are top of mind and important to this little niche of an industry of ours. I'm Ben Skelly, head of growth here at Vicarius. Less of a host, more of a facilitator of conversation for our subject matter experts who know a lot more about these topics than me. Really quick housekeeping. We aim to be brief and informative and answer any questions you might have at the end. So along the way, you can add them into the question box at the bottom of your browser here, and we'll do our best to get through them. With that out of the way, with me today is Ryan Patton. He's just up I-95 for me in Philly. Ryan has a background in security and compliance, which is perfect for what we're talking about today, making compliance easy and going beyond just compliance. So thanks for taking the time today, Ryan. Anything you want to introduce?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Yeah, my name is Ryan. I'm a Solution Architect here at Vicarius. As Ben said, we're going to be talking about compliance today, as you can see up on the screen as well. More specifically, the role that vulnerability management plays in some of the most common standards and frameworks that we're all familiar with out there. So yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, great. So compliance, not the sexiest topic in the world, but important nonetheless, and a requirement that most organizations, big and small, deal with in some capacity, including our own. So I guess let's go ahead and start there as I turn it over to you and maybe talk a little bit about the importance of compliance and some of the struggles that teams commonly face.
Yeah, definitely. So, there's really three main things that I think we can boil down a lot of compliance standards and what the benefit to organizations are. And, first, being compliant shows your customers that you've implemented these controls and practices that are regulated and standardized. This helps them know that their data is being kept safe. Second, and probably most important to some, it's going to help organizations to avoid regulatory penalties and fines. And then finally, it's also shown to actually reduce the risk of being breached in the first place. And in the event of a breach, a compliant organization is shown to have fewer records impacted, and they're able to recover more quickly.
Got it. So what are some of those difficulties around compliance?
Yeah, so it's expensive. Implementing those controls is not cheap. It can also be disruptive to organizations implementing them. Time consuming. Selecting the controls, again, implementing them, mountains of paperwork that are associated as well. And also, they're constantly changing. PCI DSS 4.0, which was just released. We'll talk about that a little bit. New ones are being released as well. So it's an ever evolving kind of battle.
Of course. So obviously we're approaching this topic from a vulnerability management lens.
Definitely.
So having kind of framed, the problem, what role does VM play at a high level in compliance?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it can be solved pretty simply through vulnerability management, and we'll see the role that it plays in these specific standards. But really, we need immediate, proactive, and really the most importantly is a simplified vulnerability remediation
Definitely.
process. We all know that IT person out there in the field that's got a mountain of CVEs they need to go and patch. So we need to make that more simple for them, and really that's the major key there.
Got it. All right, so let's get into some of the specific frameworks then. I mean, I can say as someone who doesn't deal directly with compliance other than GDPR that I do recognize some of these and know their purpose, while a few might look like word soup to me. And I may have just inadvertently triggered you because I'm sure it's similar to security where we say security is everyone's job. I suppose compliance could use that too. But let's go ahead and start at the top with PCI, which I know has been in the news plenty before.
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, this is one that we get asked about a lot. Great one to start out with. So yeah, let's get into it. It was initially developed to minimize fraud and improve security for the payment card industry. So naturally, who does it apply to? Basically any entity that stores, processes, and or transmits cardholder data. Pretty, cut and dry there.
Yeah, got it. So again, tying this back to VM then, which I think we'll do throughout,
Mm-hmm.
what role does that play with PCI? And then I think you have some classic examples you wanted to mention.
Yeah, absolutely. So, first off, it's pretty integral to PCI, really. Right off the bat, we can see, one of the primary requirements is to maintain a vulnerability management program. Again, pretty cut and dry.
Right.
So, they define that as systematically and continuously finding weaknesses in an entity's payment card infrastructure system. So I think, kind of keywords there, systematically and continuously. That's going back to what we talked about a moment ago, with kind of the process aspect as well. Not only are we implementing a new control in vulnerability management, but it's also the process that's behind it, and simplifying that as well.
Yeah.
We can also see another primary requirement is to develop and maintain secure systems and apps. Important to note the focus on eliminating vulnerabilities by installing vendor-provided patches in their definition there, you can see.
Yeah.
That's something that's, core to vulnerability management. So, really, really closely tied in with this particular regulation. A couple other kind of key takeaways they mention in their implementation guidance for this control is, they're looking for organizations to establish a process to identify and rank vulnerabilities. So, we need to discover them, but we also need to rank them in terms of what their criticality is, severity, and then be able to prioritize them as well. As you can see in the next point, based on system criticality, is this system a web-facing system? That's going to make it a lot more vulnerable and high risk. Finally, we need to aggregate and apply patches from vendors in a timely manner. So with that, let's get into some examples. Target 2013, really big one here. In the U.S., 40 million credit card numbers were stolen, and they wound up paying out over 220 million in settlements and fees. So pretty steep fine there. It was caused by a failure to respond to a critical alert in their EDR system. They had implemented this control, didn't have a policy or procedure to respond to an alert, was not triaged properly, and from there, the actors were able to move about the system and kind of exfil that data. I found this quote pretty interesting from Card Connect. They're a very large payment processor. Basically, they go on to say target strategy focused mainly on PCI compliance. There are sometimes risks that fall outside the scope of PCI. Standards also inform adversaries which measures a business is implemented, so the attacker will capitalize on vulnerabilities, not on the PCI compliance checklist. So, yeah, pretty interesting there. I think, again, this is why in the title we say going beyond compliance. We need to do so in an effective way. Of course, we want to become compliant, check that box, but we need to do so in a way that kind of moves the needle. Another great example, Equifax, really big one, probably one of the biggest ever.
Yeah.
Almost half of all Americans at the time in 2017, which was 143 million. Attackers used a widely known vulnerability. I believe it was in Apache struts. Should have been patched, but due to failures in their internal process, it wasn't. Again, going back to we all know that IT person that's got a mountain of CVEs to patch. So definitely could have been the situation there. But basically, that allowed the threat actors in, able to move about the network and find those critical systems that house that data and go and exfiltrate it.
Got it. Yeah, those were some pretty famous ones for sure. I was definitely a part of the Equifax one, like I think a lot of people were.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so let's move on to the next one, which I think is SOC 2, which I'm also pretty familiar with and know that we at Vicarius have been through that auditing process and are SOC 2 Type 2 certified, which I think is no small accomplishment.
Yeah, no, definitely. And we'll see in a moment, that's really common with a lot of SaaS companies similar to us at Vicarius and technology providers. That's really who the kind of target audience is, so to say,
Right.
for that standard. But in terms of what it is, yeah, it's an auditing procedure. It defines criteria for managing customer data. So any data that you collect as part of again those SaaS companies and technology providers. There are two types, as you mentioned. Type 1 describes a vendor's systems and whether their design is suitable to meet relevant trust principles. And type 2 is basically the operational effectiveness of those systems. Going back to who applies to, I thought this was kind of funny, pretty broad. Any any company that works with customer data. I think that's
Everybody.
pretty much every every business out there. So, but yeah, again, it is more prevalent with SaaS companies, technology providers, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, in terms of the vulnerability management side of things with SOC 2, it doesn't list specific controls as, we'll see with a lot of these standards and frameworks. Sometimes they have mappings and things like that, but, often there's going to be requirements or goals or that sort of thing. And then, you'll have to implement controls that meet that. With SOC 2, the one that most closely relates to vulnerability management is Common Criteria 7.1. That basically requires an entity to use detection and monitoring procedures to identify changes to configurations that would result in the introduction of new vulnerabilities and susceptibilities to newly discovered vulnerabilities. So again, I think with installing new applications, deploying new systems, that continuous aspect is something that we see kind of
Right.
repeated with this one as well.
Right. Got it. Yeah, so I think it's GDPR is up next on the list, which happens to be close to me and fellow people in marketing. Probably, I actually remember when that regulation went into effect, and what I guess it was 2018. And everyone was freaking out about the potential fines and the consent warnings on the website, and scrambling to put processes in place to ensure compliance. I was definitely on the front lines of that one as you walk through this.
Yeah. GDPR definitely changed a lot of things. Pretty, very strict, pretty
Right.
revolutionary, I would say. And even though it's obviously European data privacy and security law, if your customers are in Europe and you're an American company or anywhere else in the world, it's going to affect you as well, and that's something that you're going to have to keep in the back of your mind that you need to be compliant to this. So again, with who does it apply to? Yeah, any organization that stores PII of any EU citizens. So that can be your customers, or if you collect data. Again, you mentioned the kind of marketing and ad aspect of that. Definitely applies.
Yeah.
Vulnerability management's role. There's a couple different points there. The data controller and processor and their responsibilities do surround the reduction of risk and maintenance of the CIA triad to protect that data. There are different tiers for fines, which we'll get into in a moment, and those are affected by what steps your company has taken to mitigate and what precautionary measures you've put in place, again through technical controls or through policies and procedures.
Got it.
So, I think GDPR is pretty interesting. We can, kind of look at it as a security posture indicator. And I think this can be translated to a lot of the other standards. Obviously the numbers are going to change a bit, but overall, organizations who are within compliance and they're ready to comply to GDPR were much less likely to be breached, as we talked about a little earlier. The records that were impacted in a breach were much lower, as you can see, and the breach downtime, that's a huge factor, about 3 weeks difference there. So
Yeah.
not only are you going to have to consider the fines associated with a GDPR related breach, or any breach with that matter, the fines that may be associated, but also just the cost of downtime to a business. So, it's really, I think this reinforces the importance of compliance.
Definitely.
So up next, GDPR is,
Yeah.
if it's known for anything, it's known for its fines. We can see here, again, we talked about that tier-based sort of fine system. Um, at the high end, it can be 4% of a company's yearly revenue. We see some pretty big names here. They've got some pretty big revenue. That's part of why we see these fines are so big. And I think that's also per offense. So you see here Google got hit a couple times.
Right.
In 2021. It's not one and done. You're good for the year. You can definitely rack up a pretty big bill.
That's a lot of Google, but holy Amazon, almost a billion in GDPR alone. That's
Yeah,
insane. I think I'd have a heart attack with that, which
absolutely.
I guess leads us nicely into what's next with HIPAA, huh?
Yeah, perfect segue. Healthcare. Basically, there was a law passed by Congress in 1996. Specifically included some regulations designed to ensure confident. Again, we see the CIA triad, recurring theme here. But this time aimed at PHI, personal health information. So of course, naturally, it's going to apply to healthcare providers. That can be hospitals, doctors' offices, pharmaceutical companies that have a customer base, any of those sort of industries. Vulnerability management, plays a pretty important role with HIPAA as well. That PHI is extremely sensitive, not something that want getting out into the public. So they do require a risk management plan. And they define that as security measures sufficient to reduce risks and vulnerabilities to a reasonable and appropriate level, which is as low as we want, right? Or as low as we can get them.
Right.
Vulnerability management is an important component of your risk analysis, risk management, and periodic evaluation process. In addition to helping you evaluate the effectiveness of your current protective measures, it can identify new vulnerabilities so you can close security holes before they're exploited by hackers. I think healthcare is one of those that we see exploited quite a bit. I think there's a multitude of reasons. Again, that data is highly sensitive. So they're going to try to get that as much as they can, and also just the nature of some of these businesses, legacy systems, and that sort of thing. So I'd say vulnerability management is a huge importance to those companies, and really that continuous vulnerability discovery.
They are a major target. All right, so let's get into some of the other popular standards like the ISO 27001, if I'm saying that correctly, and Nist, which
Yeah.
I know we deal with quite often.
Yeah, definitely. So we've got ISO up next here. It's an international standard. It helps organizations manage their security of their assets. Basically provides a framework, ensures the CIA triad once again, and availability of all that corporate data. This one, it's not really necessarily industry specific. It's actually one of the most widely used, and really any business can benefit from it. So pretty unique to some of the ones we talked about earlier in that sense. So the vulnerability management role within ISO 27001, they do have a technical vulnerability management requirement with an objective to avoid vulnerabilities from being exploited. They have control information on technological vulnerabilities of information systems. Use should be obtained in a timely manner. The exposure of the organization to such vulnerabilities should be assessed and appropriate measures taken to address the risk involved. So, discovering vulnerabilities as they're being introduced, whether that's discovering a new vulnerability that's publicized out in the wild, or if that's installing new applications or new endpoints, we want to be covering all of those different facets. They do provide some implementation guidance as well. And they recommend an up-to-date and comprehensive asset inventory. That's definitely a huge aspect to any breach. We need to know which systems were affected, and we can only do that if we have an asset inventory. And they go on to say it's necessary for the effective management of vulnerability. Software vendor version numbers, current installation status, people responsible, all playing a role in that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, up next we've got Nist, another really common one. I would say up there with ISO. Yeah, it's Nist compliance is interesting. There's so many different standards and frameworks within Nist. So Nist compliance is just complying with the requirements of one or more of those standards. It's a non-regulatory agency, and it's under the U.S. Department of Commerce. Its primary role is to develop standards that apply to various industries. So again, with application, we do see a lot of federal agencies, manufacturers, service providers, who are interacting with CUI, that kind of thing, doing business with the government. But it's also something on the other side that can be implemented in small and medium businesses, and that would greatly increase their security posture as well. So let's take a look at the vulnerability management role within Nist. So Special Publication 1271, there's 5 key functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. And within those, we have goals to maintain hardware and software inventory, very similar to what we just saw in ISO. Identify threats, vulnerabilities, and risks to assets, protect your devices, and manage device vulnerability. So I think those are all pretty well aligned with vulnerability management. Again, taking that asset inventory, recognizing the new vulnerabilities that are being introduced into your environment, and remediating them in a timely manner. There are also, if we look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, which is the CSF, there are subcategories within the risk assessment, the information protection processes and procedures, and the security continuous monitoring that all directly correlate to vulnerability management.
All right. All right. Well, thanks for all that, Ryan. A lot to take in for sure. Let's start putting a bow on this, I guess, and tie it all together with what these frameworks and standards have in common.
Yeah, definitely. So key takeaways, I think what do those all have in common? What are the commonalities there? We talked about the CIA triad multiple times. We want to maintain and uphold confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's pretty common amongst any security related standard, framework, policy, procedure. They're all kind of pushing towards maintaining that. Within that, of course, we want to prevent data breaches. And then finally, we achieve that by implementing robust controls and also effective policies and procedures to support those controls. We don't want to have a situation, again, going back to that Target example, I think they spent around $2 million on FireEye as their EDR, but because they didn't have policies and procedures to support that, that alert was left pretty much, untriaged.
Nice. All right. Yeah. So coming, I guess, full circle then, and tying this back to VM, what do you say is the role that a platform like our own, like Topia, can play in the process? And then after that, we'll quickly get into any questions, which, again, really quick before you start, you can still submit in the question box at the bottom of the browser if you'd like. But anyway, back to you, Ryan.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So, we talked about effective vulnerability management, effective security controls, making sure we're, not implementing these controls just to check the box, but doing so in a way that moves the needle and increases our security posture. So, when we look at that from the vulnerability management side, obviously we're biased towards our own platform, but I think that's for good reason. We bake all of this into it, and we've thought about this, when developing it and creating it. So really, there's kind of 3 key aspects to that, and number 1 is the continuous discovery. Again, going back to my earlier example of that IT guy everyone knows with hundreds or thousands of CVEs they've got to patch out in their production environment. Number of disclosed vulnerabilities are at record highs. I think last year was 22,000, and it equates to something like 60 or so a day. So yeah, quarterly, monthly, any kind of infrequent scanning is really no longer sufficient. We believe that a continuous real-time system is the way to go, and that's why Topia is set up that way. It's an agent which is installed on the endpoint and reports back to the dashboard, in real time, what these vulnerabilities are. I think a key aspect is, the context and the priority. Vulnerability can score a perfect 10 on CVSS, and you would think, okay, I need to go address that right away. And, that's not always the case.
Right.
If this is on some system that's, doesn't have any access anywhere, it's on a segmented part of the network, maybe there's other controls that sort of mitigate the risk in place that the CVSS doesn't really tell the whole story. So context on where the vulnerability exists within the environment will actually allow us to determine the true risk. And then from there, we can prioritize and spend our resources accordingly. So, we want to make sure, especially this is something that I think smaller and medium-sized businesses don't necessarily have the resources that larger enterprises do. If you're just looking at a 10 on a CVSS, you may not be looking at the right place. So you want to be very particular on where you're going and spending those resources. And again, going back to Topia, the agent automatically takes some of these key context factors into place, and it reports that into the dashboard. So we can look at different risk models and say, okay, this one has high exploit probability, it's an RCE attack, something like that. We can mark that as a high priority, and it does that all automatically behind the scenes. So you truly know where to spend your resources. And then finally, the automatic remediation. Some reports have shown up to 180 days for some organizations' patching cycles, which is yeah, definitely. Traditional methods, they're just too manual, requiring multiple tools. Sometimes you'll have to have a vulnerability scanner and then a separate system to, go and remediate them. You have to aggregate all the patches from the vendor manually. Especially today's distributed workloads, that becomes more difficult because you have people working from home, that sort of thing. Maybe they're not VPN to the office to get the patch put out. So Topia aggregates all the patches automatically. We can push them out through the agent. It's a cloud-based system. So, we can push them out anywhere, and it's compatible with all major operating system families, Mac, Windows, Linux, and we also have some other options around patchless protection too for systems that can't be patched. Maybe it's a legacy system where there's a patch that's not available, or it's in production and it could be a disruption to the business to patch it. So we can apply that patchless protection to give it some mitigate some of the risk, but while we can't patch it essentially.
Got it. Perfect. Okay, so questions. So I have one of my own, actually. Having mentioned at the top that security is everyone's job, and I'm sure compliance is the same. Is that an accurate statement, or maybe asked another way, who's typically responsible for really owning these compliance standards at your typical organization?
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely, like you said, it takes a village. If you look at the whole process of selecting tools to meet the requirements and all of the different steps that go into this, there's really something that takes a lot of different positions within the organization. But if you talk about ultimately responsible, at the end of the day, senior management is going to be kind of the one that is looked to in that sense. Security needs to come down from the top. It all starts at senior management. They'll also probably be the ones held culpable in any kind of fine or penalty. So definitely, senior management for sure.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, so another one kind of calling me out here. Been used framework and standard interchangeably throughout. If my understanding, these are not the same thing. Care to explain to him the difference?
Yeah, so that's definitely a pretty common thing that comes up. You see them, kind of intertwined, I guess you could say. Generally, the distinction is standards are a bit less vague than frameworks. Frameworks are more kind of focused on goals. They're a bit more broad. Standards typically offer a bit more guidance in terms of what needs to be done to achieve those goals.
Yeah, today I learned. All right, one more here. With all of these not applying to every business, how do you determine which standards or frameworks apply to your organization?
Yeah, another good question. So, Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at the data that you're working with. Obviously, the industry you're in will play a large role in that. HIPAA is pretty clear. Basically healthcare organizations. There are some others that are similar. We can look at the defense industry, CMMC, DFARS, et cetera. So yeah, it really comes down to the data that you're working with. Um, if there's not a data requirement or regulation, then yeah, you can also look at, say you want to implement the Nist CSF or one of the ISO standards. I think with that, you almost would want to do maybe possibly even a business impact analysis on some of your assets and see kind of what risk model makes the most sense for you, and then you can kind of implement from there.
Makes sense. All right, well, let's wrap it up on that note. Thank you to everyone watching live and on demand. And of course, thank you, Ryan, for
Yeah.
sharing your expertise on compliance and how we can uncomplicate an otherwise complicated set of rules. I'm sure we'll see you again on our webinar series here, likely sooner rather than later. Keep an eye out for the next edition. And of course, shameless plug real quick. If you want to start a free trial or just see our solution, Topia, in action, including everything it can do for compliance, just go to vicarius.io and click the start button. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thanks everyone.